Good. All right. So, welcome everybody to the April research call. For those of you that are new to these calls, we do just like a minute or two of admin catch-up stuff, and then we hand it over to the research presenter for the day. So today we're gonna, I think Jennifer, you've got a couple of announcements, or maybe Caroline, just quick updates about CSCRS admin.
This is Jennifer. I'll go over them today. We sent you our very minimal agenda, so hopefully you got that. One thing I did want to talk about is that we're working on getting all the information about the year 2 research projects posted on the website and also in the research in progress database. And this is among the many reasons why we do this is to meet the US DOT requirements for posting within 2 months of awarding the research. So the many, not all, of the year 2 projects are now posted on our research projects page, as you'll see. And we have a couple more additions to make to this page, a couple more projects we're going to add at the end. But those are already up, actually ahead of schedule, so that's nice. So by next Monday, we will be have those all ready to go. And we're also working on an announcement about year 2 funded research that will go out hopefully sometime next week. We're also, as we've mentioned, you've gotten many emails about one of our reporting requirements. I call it the 3PR, and it's the Program Progress Performance Report. I may not have those words totally right, but it's a 3PR report that outlines all of our activities since last June. And that is in its 3rd draft, and that is ready to be, that will be submitted to US DOT next Monday, and it will be posted on the website that day too, so you'll be able to see it then. And thank you to everybody who contributed content and updates for that. The other really big thing, and one other really big thing that we're working on still is the planning for our Big State Systems Summit this September, September 13th and 14th. And the most immediate thing that's coming up is we will be launching registration. It looks like that's going to happen early next week. So we will be able to start accepting registrations early next week, so that's very exciting. We've been doing a lot of work on the schedule, the program, and we may have mentioned this before, but if you didn't know already, we do have a keynote speaker in the form of Rod McClure, the noted safe systems expert from Australia. So that's a very exciting thing, and we think he'll be a big draw. So he is in the process of being officially nailed down in terms of travel and everything like that. And let's see, we've also been doing a lot of work on a poster session that we're going to have with student posters. That's going to be the Thursday of this conference. It's September 13th. That after the day's program, we'll have a poster session, and that'll be a contest which will award prizes for the best poster. So those are the latest developments that we've been spending some time on. And of course, there's much more work to do on that on the Safe Systems Summit. Let's see, the last update that I'll mention, and I'm sure Tab will want to reiterate at some point, or we'll be talking about in the future, is we are almost done with research presentations from our year 1 research investigators. We have a couple more of those left, but then moving forward, we will be asking our year 2 PIs to start presenting on their research. So be prepared to be asked to present at a future research call. We're going to continue the research calls every month, throughout, for the life of the grant, as far as we know. But the way that these calls have been working so hard, and we'd like to see them continue to work, is to have a research presentation each time. So those are my main updates for now. Does anybody have any questions about those things? All right, well, I'm done, Tab.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. And Jennifer was right. I do want to sort of reiterate. Please let me know if you are a year 2 PI. If there are any 4th Wednesdays in which you know in advance you have a conflict, so I don't call and harangue you about wanting to have you as a presenter. if there are any Wednesdays that you do, if you want to get feedback early on, if you want to be one of the earlier presenters, please let me know. If you want to wait, if you're the kind of person who likes to wait until you've got something hard and fast to talk about, let me know that as well. Otherwise, I'll just be emailing fairly randomly to try and peg people down to presentation dates. And so my email is tab@unc.edu. It's one of those really complicated ones. And so just look for emails from me, or you can go ahead and email me if you've got a preference, whether you want to be earlier, later, or not on a particular date. And that that's all I got. I want to turn things over to Seth, who's going to be talking about structures of stakeholder relationships in making road safety decisions. So one of our final year one presenters. Seth is going to have pretty much the entire time to talk and do Q&A at the end. So Seth, have at it.
Hey, thanks so much, Tab and Jennifer, for arranging all this. And thanks everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to be among colleagues to talk about some of the very interesting work I think we're doing. I'm not biased in any sense, but just give you a sense of what we've been up to, what kind of trouble we've been up to, and who the troublemakers are. You can see here we have a couple of the centers here at UNC engaged in this, myself and my colleague Stephen Heine, but also with the Injury Prevention Research Center here at UNC under Steve Marshall. We working with him and Kelly Evenson, who I believe is on the phone, and Becky Nauman, who's also on the phone. And I'm going to be talking about some of the work that that they've all been involved in as well. UC Berkeley, we have Jill Cooper. Hello, Jill, and Sarah Doggett working with us, particularly in this sort of the Bay Area there, gathering data there, very helpful. One of the things we really try to understand with this project is how decisions are made. And we wanted to look at we wanted to sort of cast a broad net at first to understand what exactly was sort of the structure across the country in terms of safe systems. Where is our field at right now? Where are sort of the road safety professionals at in terms of the networks they've already developed across the country, but also within different municipalities? How do they kind of structure organizationally their decision making? So we've taken a broad look across the country, but also are zeroed in on a few of these kind of what we'll call opinion leading cities in the US. So the questions we had with this were that we're looking really at the opinion leaders. They seem to be driving change. This is based on theory from diffusion of innovations. We really want to understand who those leaders are. We wanted to look at those cities that seem to be sort of the early adopters of safe systems or Vision Zero. We wanted to look at some of the plans that they had. So what are their intentions with regards to safety? And then look at sort of the organization, again, getting that deeper dive into the cities to understand the organizations and the actors involved. We're pretty sure that this really hasn't been done before. We have a sense of who's involved, but how are they involved exactly, and how do they share information? And then ultimately, what kind of decisions is that process making with regards to traffic safety? So just related it back to the CSCRS, we really think that this touches upon two different sort of focus areas. The integrated systems, this is inherently interdisciplinary. We're using methods and theory from sociology, political science, systems, mapping, but also the workplace, or the transportation workforce culture that is. We really want to sort of broaden the base of people engaged in this and really prop up examples of this really highly integrated and diversified field of actors involved in safe systems. So the way we structured it was into kind of three phases. We first did a practitioner survey, and then we looked at sort of their Vision Zero plans, those who have plans publicly available. And then we did that deep dive into a detailed organizational network analysis. Again, though I'm listed as a PI on this, my colleagues at UC Berkeley and here at UNC are really instrumental in sort of shaping the way this project has taken shape, and also the direction it's kind of gone. So I thank them for a lot of the work here. So just first touching upon the practitioner survey. This involves sort of a sociological method that's used often in communications, in other fields like nursing and sort of pedagogy. We want to do a sociometric survey of road safety professionals. We're looking at a lot of the work from Deering, especially James Deering, that is, at the University of Michigan. He does a lot of work with diffusion. Part of this is sort of a formative evaluation, understanding who's kind of involved and who are the leaders. And what's interesting, I think, looking at some of the literature on diffusion innovations theory, looking at sort of synthesis of those, that any innovation, so if we call safe systems an innovation, it's never random, it's never instantaneous. In fact, it follows a very predictable pattern of social influence, which I'll touch upon. So we looked at these different groups of people: planners, engineers, public health, those particularly involved in injury prevention, law enforcement, emergency response. We stole their emails from different directories, like professional organizations that we were involved in or at conferences, things like that. We called them together. We got about 1,700 contacts through this. We had about a little over 20% were willing to participate. And then most of those people said, yes, their work involved understanding or improving the safety of people on roadways. And then ultimately we ended up with about a 10% response rate with professionals that provided the complete response, which is basically letting us know who they are, what field they worked in, and also identifying some individuals, organizations, or municipalities that they look to for advice. So basically we asked these three questions, a number of questions, but this was sort of the crux of this effort. The individuals, organizations, and municipalities outside of their own organization or municipality whose reputation they follow with respect to the work on reducing. So we're literally looking for sort of those sources of advice that are out there. This is a very common method used, again, in other fields, particularly nursing and pedagogy. The results we found was that if you look at the network, which I'll show a graphic of that in a minute, but if you look at it, there's a nation-spanning inner-city network of advice seeking. When we looked at the individuals, the groups they were looking to and the ties among them, there are quite a few. There's 230 cities involved and then about 372 ties among them. What was interesting too is that this was, again, nation spanning indeed. They crossed these large kind of census boundaries. Half of them did. But those that did have this sort of within census boundaries, they were highest, the densities were highest in the Northeast and lowest in the South. People in the South tended to look outside the region more than other people in other regions. So here's kind of the graphic of the inner city advice network. Those nodes, if you will, that are larger, and then the associated names of the cities that are larger you see there means that they have a higher degree of what's called in-degree centrality. Basically, it's just another way of saying they're referenced a lot by other people. And so we took major interest in sort of these opinion leaders, as we called them. And when we looked at them, those who were about 2 standard deviations above the norm in terms of average just references, there were 7 of them that emerged in order of in-degree centrality. And these are the 7 cities here. You can kind of see a pattern of basically mostly coastal, larger, progressive U.S. cities. And again, with this insight that we really wanted to identify the opinion leaders, because when opinion leaders are not adopting an innovation, evidently systems just simply don't change when that happens. There's all this theory behind that, but that's definitely a key finding from a lot of the research. And then we also looked at sort of what we would call boundary spanners, or sometimes called brokers. They tended to be a lot of the same, just given the number of ties that are references to the cities. But one interesting one was Minneapolis, which really bumped up here in the ranking for betweenness centrality. What's interesting from this literature on boundary spanning, like we had noted before, it was coastal, right? For the most part, progressive cities. You do tend to see this clustering in terms of attitude, behaviors, the homogeneity of the groups. But boundary spanners tend to kind of occupy a couple of different groups. So they actually more attuned to divergent ways of thinking. And they often provide that sort of gap, the bridge building across gaps. And so they seem to have a really important role to play in terms of the innovativeness of maybe how cities structure their safe systems approaches. So we want to engage them. So in a phase 2 of this, so we look now across the whole network. We wanted to see those who are sort of early adopting into Vision Zero, because that seems to be the way it's framed in the US, Vision Zero safe systems is Vision Zero plans. We looked at 14 cities' plans, and we found basically we haven't really really taken a close look at these yet. We did some content analysis and just some preliminary sort of gestation of that, because we understand that there's a year 2 project that's really going to take it to the next level. It's going to be led by Kelly Evenson, called Strengthening Existing Facilitating New Vision Zero Plans. So we thought, this could provide sort of a foundation perhaps upon which this year 2 project will definitely take it to the next level. But still we found that when you look at the plans, cities tend to talk about their safety problems in very global terms, just in sheer number of injuries and fatalities, maybe sometimes dividing it up by group of road user, sometimes talking about different neighborhoods or districts, not often though. Most of them did have sort of a diverse array of professionals, so you have sort of the planning and engineering, the traditional partners, law enforcement, but you also, a lot of these places had public health, they had preservation groups, they had different sort of interest groups involved as well. But probably because of the first one, in terms of talking about safety in global terms, there wasn't a real clear link between sort of the interventions they were proposing in the plans and then identified safety problems. So they said they're going to do this laundry list of things with all these partners, but they weren't really linked with safety problems. And then sort of in best practices in our field, right, they had a lot of metrics, but not a lot of sort of performance measurement reference in terms of if they found that they're off course or that they should change up strategy, how they would adapt to that, how they sort of manage the performance. And I think maybe one city had looked at sort of the proactive risk-based or systemic safety approaches. Not a lot of them were doing that. It was still very hotspot analysis focused, if they did that at all, actually. So these are just some preliminary findings. Now I know Kelly's project from year 2 is going to really shed a lot more light on this subject. So phase 3, the phase that we're currently in, just talk about that briefly and some preliminary results from that, thanks to Becky Nauman on the phone here. What this involved was coordinating with the Vision Zero network to identify what we were calling sort of the key contacts in those in 4 opinion leading cities. So that was from the phase 1 where we had looked at the opinion leading cities. We wanted to look at really the top 4, just given constraints that we had, right, for the project. So this was New York, Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco. We engaged those key contacts, and we got from them, a list of people and the organizations they're affiliated with that were really sort of central to the city's Vision Zero network or their efforts. And then it involves really doing sort of structured interviews with 8 to 15. So it was actually a survey that we did over the phone with anywhere between 5 and 15 people in each of the city's networks. We looked at sort of how frequently they were contacting each other, the productivity that they perceived in terms of the relationship among the different agencies, and then the resources that they were sharing. So what I'm going to present to you is some of the work that Becky has done preliminarily. I know she's sort of further develop in these, but this is just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So some of the systems mapping will look something like this, where the reason we have them sort of generically labeled like this was because a lot of the cities, especially as it came to the productivity of the relationship, they did not want to be identified. I think a lot of them, these relationships for a lot of the agencies are new, relatively speaking, and they didn't really want to sort of challenge that at all. They didn't want any kind of mishaps there. So we see that government, at least one of the entities in the government, and in this case, this city was, I think it was Portland City. Yeah. No, it wasn't Portland. I'm sorry, Seattle.
Don't say the city, and then you can tell us more about it.
Sure, yeah. So I can't tell you very much about this, but I can say, as you can see, so from the kind of size of the connection, the bands there, just the frequency of contact, that there is sort of one central organizing entity, and that some of them are a little more peripheral, right? Especially the ones from industry. The nonprofits seem to be a little more involved with the governmental entities, and industry less so. This is just contact frequency. This is productivity, so it's sort of bidirectional, or looking, one direction at a time. Each got to weigh in on how productive they perceive the relationship to be between the entities. You can see sort of the darker green equates to kind of more productive, less lighter, a little less productive. So you can see some of the relationship structures between sort of nonprofit and the governments, industry and government, and then among the nonprofits and the industry. Which is interesting is that it doesn't seem to be a lot of coordination among the industry and the nonprofits, right? It's more, yeah, Libby, you had a...
Can you say more about what you mean by industry here in this context?
Sure, yeah. For this group, this is really industry, maybe like bike shops, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So groups that aren't necessarily like nonprofits,
literally
but that are
commercial sector.
Yeah, mostly like commercial sector groups.
And nonprofit would include research organizations.
In this case, I don't believe it did, but mostly advocacy. So yeah, and so there's definitely different structures. One of the interesting things we'll have from this is just from one city. We'll have it for 3. One sort of fell through. We just weren't able to contact enough people in the city to get enough of the sense of the network itself. But in 3 cities, we'll have diagrams like this, and they're all going to be different. Mm-hmm. And what we're going to do is sort of tie this with the decisions that are resulting with that. And so this is just some of the resource sharing that we're seeing, or that they had reported. So you can see maybe 1 or 2 central, right, entities, and others who are sort of isolated, right? Maybe just talking to one, like in the case of G with the industry there. But there remains to be seen. This is a structure at one city. We're interested in sort of the 2 others to see how they kind of differ, compare and contrast, and then writing those results up. What does it mean? And then starting to look at the safety projects that they've funded over the past year. We're really trying to understand the decisions that are resulting from these kind of structures here. We're going to be looking at projects individually by a certain rubric, if you will, looking at the efficiency. If there is a cheaper way to do it, then that would be interesting to note. May not be. Any type of safety-based evidence of it? Do we have any evidence that this is working, or even theory that would suggest that? And then equity, given a lot of these cities are really good at sort of identifying their issues and having good assessments of that, and they put it out in the public realm. Are they basically allocating resources to places where, equitably, if you will? And then looking holistically. So it gets back to those plans that we had noted. The clarity of links between identified problems and the proposed countermeasures. So does it make a lot of sense to, basically what they're saying the problems are and the proposed countermeasures that they, and then are they using anything else beyond sort of this hotspot analysis? Are they using maybe risk-based and looking for patterns out there? So what this will essentially result in are what I was mentioning before, sort of the detailed maps looking at the structure. And actually, it'll be 3 leading cities this time. It's kind of a misnomer there, but we'll have this sort of sense of what that looks like, and of course, the decisions that seem to result from that. And then we'll have some academic reports coming out. We have one that's sort of in press right now. It's just looking at sort of the diffusion a little bit of Vision Zero, just awareness of that among different professional groups. One of the interesting findings from that was that the public health and law enforcement have kind of become more aware of what Vision Zero is later than kind of the professional planners and engineers. And then definitely saw some regional differences, like in the Midwest, they have been a little bit delayed in even being aware of Vision Zero. We're gonna put something on that sort of phase 1, another paper in on sort of the inner city, the advice network, the methods we use and what we had found. And then also we look to submit something else on a framework for doing this sort of network analytics like that. And that'll definitely be led by Becky, because I have no idea what I'm doing in that realm. What we hope is that because of if opinion leading cities are the ones that are referenced so much and they're actually followed a lot, we really want to engage with those cities so that we're working with them to do sort of really solid work. And then to come up with some type of self-assessment for cities that they can engage in, so they can really think critically about their kind of network structures that they're setting up that seem to relate to just better decision making. But I think with that, I'm just going to kind of open it up. Thank you for listening, and any questions or discussions you want to have about anything I just talked about. Oh, we have
Hey, Seth.
Hey there.
Oh, this is Kelly.
Hey, Kelly.
I was just going to add, at least for Seattle, the examples of nonprofits would be the Cascade Bicycle Club. There's also a Neighborhood Greenways organization. And then the commercial group that we had was Lyft.
Lyft, that's right.
Great example. Yeah, I've heard, thank you for that clarification. Seth has talked a little bit about that engagement and the importance of it.
Seth, this is really exciting.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask the typical question, can we get the slides and can we share them with others?
Of course. I think, Jennifer, you were saying that you make them available, they're right online.
Yeah, we post the slides from these research calls on the reporting page, so they're available there. That is here. I'll show you where that is real quick. So yes, you will have access to these slides.
Great, thanks.
I'll show you what that page looks like real quick. Come back.
Hey Seth, this is Chris Cherry. I have a question. Did you run into any instances where smaller towns and cities, let's say in the South, Knoxville, Tennessee, for example, or many others, maybe resisted relying on kind of big coastal cities experiences? I get that sometimes. You know, we're not New York City, we're not San Francisco, so therefore we adopt different strategies. Is that something that you ran into? Is there a typical middle-sized, smaller city that would be a good example? Like I want to say Minneapolis or Denver, but those are big cities too.
Right. No, you know, we didn't actually look at. I know exactly what you're talking about, Chris, with cities that might not identify with some of these larger progressive cities. We did not have, I don't think, a large enough sample to sort of stratify by that, but that would be very interesting, and I think it would be a logical next step is to really improve the sample we were able to get, like grow it and really start stratifying by, okay, yeah, who are like smaller, mid-sized cities, smaller cities, who are they looking to? And how can we, who are their leaders, if you will? Because I think you would probably see that stratification, I would imagine. Yeah.
Seth, so when you were talking about how usually there's a clear pattern of adoption and your opinion leaders are the ones who lead the innovation and others follow them, is there something that triggers the initial adoption of that innovation that you found? Say, for example, with Sweden adopting Vision Zero initially, it was because there was a large incident with a ferry sinking. It was kind of the thing that kicked off their big change. But with here in the US, have you seen anything that sort of is that first trigger for the opinion leaders?
For the first trigger.
Hey, can I interrupt and say, when you guys are kind of projecting a conversation, so it's really easy. It's hard for us to follow if people don't introduce themselves.
Sorry,
if people could say their name.
This is Wes.
So you guys are all in a room together, and there's like two rooms. There's the physical room and the virtual room, and you need to introduce yourself to the virtual room as well as the physical room.
Fair enough.
So
did everyone
sorry.
Is the question or?
No, I just am jet lagged, so it's really bothering me.
Got it.
Sorry, for anyone who didn't hear, this is Wes from HSRC who just asked Seth that question.
Yeah, so Wes had asked, so the sort of the what would be called in diffusion, the innovators, the people that are the first ones to sort of adopt something, what might have inspired them. I can't say for sure what it was in Sweden that inspired them. I know that sort of the identified first or innovator with Vision Zero in the US was New York City. And it's not exactly clear what inspired. I think there was this kind of growing sense of urgency to act for whatever reason. It may have been, to some people we've been talking to, it was sort of the growth of this organization called Families for Safe Streets that have really brought to the fore the impact of sort of traffic violence, as they frame it, on sort of the families. And so politicians in the city decided, that inspired them to kind of take action, to form, task force about Vision Zero and to do something about it, So I think that happened in that case, but I think just generally, it looks like some people are sort of risk-taking, or entities, organizations, cities, municipalities, and that others wait for them to do that, to see how it plays out, and they're a little more risk adverse, and then if it works out well, that's when you start seeing diffusion, right? They'll adopt it as well. If once opinion leaders get on board, then you really start seeing it taking off. So I think that's what's happening here, at least with Vision Zero stuff. Yeah, Libby.
I would like to know the role of research in this process, because there was this series of white papers kicked off about towards zero deaths, and I forget about that happened about 2010, I think.
Yeah.
And then in 2012, we made some presentations at Pro Walk, Pro Bike, and I think there was kind of a convergence of these ideas. And so I just wonder, did that influence the early adopters who pay attention to research? You would like to think that it matters, but how hard is it to document that?
I know.
That was Libby Thomas.
I beg your pardon. Libby Thomas speaking at HSRC.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This is Jill from UC Berkeley, and I'm just a couple of comments quickly. Chris, when we do presentations or speak at conferences or do workshops here in California, we are very careful about whether or not to reference San Francisco. So even in California, we have to play down the connection. We can't use San Francisco as an example for many of the same reasons that you mentioned earlier. And then my other comment is I think one of the challenges that the Vision Zero programs are facing with regard to whether or not they focus on, they do the focus on hotspots or look at more proactive safe systems analyses and approaches, is that I think there's such a, when Vision Zero programs, start in these cities, or when any traffic safety programs, everything is so reactive, and there's such, especially with the Vision Zero programs, I think they tend to be, or at least in San Francisco, very political. And I think that there's a lot of pressure on them to develop these hotspot approaches. That's what gets communicated well to the public, and that's what the public often wants. And so I think it'll be interesting as Vision Zero programs, as the field progresses, to look at how that tension shifts between the reactive and the proactive. And I think then the need for communication about the proactive piece is so important. So, this project has been super exciting in thinking about how we can better communicate the safe systems approach.
Yes, I agree, Joe.
Hey, Jill, this is Wes. Just kind of a slide related to that note. I was talking about safe systems and Vision Zero with some students when I was in a very conservative city in Texas before coming up here. And some of the students had a pushback to Vision Zero because it felt like it was sort of government telling you what to do, or that sort of thing. There was kind of this fear that it was a lot of legal requirements coming from maybe, like you say, a more progressive center. So like you said, there is this issue with communicating Vision Zero and safe systems, and how is it you talk about that with folks who maybe fear government intrusion, I think is pretty critical.
That's a great point, Wes. Yeah.
Wow.
I think
It's
I thought
funny.
about that too, Wes.
This is Seth. I remember if you were here for the Coffee and Conversations with Lucinda Austin with UNC. So she's in the Media and Journalism School here at UNC, and one of the theories she referenced, which I think is highly relevant for our field, is reactance theory. And it is that idea that, when people feel like their freedom is threatened, they react in a very negative way. Think about sort of gun running, when they even talk about sort of regulating gun ownership, or what happened in LA with road diets. They were putting out road diets sort of in a very logical way, based upon sort of injury and things. But there's a group of people that organized and said, had them essentially removed because it was sort of impinging upon their mobility. I think we have to deal with that and understand it. So that relates to one of the things that we talk about. So I think Nancy Poland-Suffert's on the phone, is that, really understanding those places that are ready for different sort of measures, traffic calming, whatever it might be. And that relates to a lot of times places where children are walking, biking, schools, playgrounds, parks, things like that. And it seems like you get more traction and less reactance when you have places like that.
And hey everyone, this is Jennifer Woody, and I just wanted to jump in here because I think it's a really great opportunity to tout kind of the practitioner end of things, and just that the collaborative and action inquiry piece of the systems thinking approach that we're doing in injury prevention, public health, is exactly this. It's designed exactly to draw out these things where people may have disagreements, resistance, whatever it may be, and it isn't always going to be resistance to a government intervention. It could be whatever issues people might have out there, and then proactively draw them out, and then also proactively and collaboratively address them so that these great ideas don't get waylaid by all the different opinions and things that collaborative groups can bring at you.
This is David Ragland from SafeTrack, and there's we get this in the Bay Area. There's something called the Bay Area One Plan Transportation, and in hearings around the Bay Area, some of these got very heated. I mean, they're talking about putting in transit villages. And of course, this impacts people in those local areas a lot. And there's a professor named Karen Frick here in City and Regional Planning who attended these meetings and did interviews with people to find out more in depth what their objections were. And that could be another tool, is to, I mean, hate to say it, but to study the resistance. And it may be that there's some very legitimate concerns out there. And I think this is probably reflected in almost any issue in society, but since we're focused on transportation. But one other comment, I don't know, would be interesting to correlate maybe in the longer run the various policies and so on that are being implemented along with crash rates. And one could do a study of region by region or state by state, kind of an ecologic kind of study to look at the relationship. I mean, that's the ultimate outcome, right, is reducing fatalities and severe injuries. But there, you know, that could be a sort of follow-up to something like this, to link crash rates to what we're calling receptivity to, you know, different ideas about.
So thank you, David. This is Seth from HSRC. Chris Cherry with UTK asked, are any of the 3 cities that are going to do that sort of deep dive into typical cities? And I will say categorically, no, not in any way. We have Seattle, San Francisco, and New York. And what's interesting about that is it's very much in line with sort of what you find in how ideas and innovations diffuse, right? At first, we talk about it all the time across fields as preaching to the choir. Well, that's generally how things diffuse. At first, the choir are the ones that adopt something, and then the population sort of follows after that. So what we're identifying is the choir. We're going to do a deep dive and really understand their structures and prop up ones that are worth kind of propping up, if you will, if there are any, so that those who are coming on later, this sort of early majority or whatever you want to call that group, are, you know, emulating something worth emulating, if you will. But that's a great question. Typical cities, I think that, again, that's a realm for further research to start looking into that. Sure.
And
Hi,
Seth,
this is okay. This is Asad. Just wanted to just get your opinion on the curve that you've mentioned, the diffusion curve. So where are we on that curve, you think, nationally? Like, let's say if there are 200 cities nationally, and, you know, maybe have 20 of them adopted this kind of Vision Zero, and, you know, there is I guess, a threshold which you think has these cities have passed, which, you know, would be indicative of them having adopted or not adopted. So I'm just wondering if we are in the early adopter stage, or we need to worry about the laggards, or, you know, where we are on that curve.
So that's a great question. In fact, I looked at that earlier last week, and it's really hard to understand what the denominator is. So one of the arbitrary denominators I kind of just selected was cities of 100,000 people or more. I just picked that, and there's apparently 307 of those in the US. And if you looked at the groups that sort of are identified as those having adopted Vision Zero, there's about 30 of them, maybe a little more. So we're at about 10% adoption. And that's interesting, because that would put us right in that early adopter phase, right? Because we're at before critical mass hits around 15 to 20%, right? So critical mass happens, right. You know, if you're not familiar with it, it happens basically where it becomes sort of self-organizing, where enough have adopted it that it just becomes sort of this self-propelling phenomenon, and it starts diffusing through the culture. So I think, Assad, great question. I think we are in that sort of early adopting phase still. It would be awesome if we were at the laggards, if we were already there. But Don't think we're quite there yet. Yep.
Yeah, this is Becky. I just wanted to mention one thing with respect to what Wes was asking related to triggers for uptake of Vision Zero. So it's actually in our organizational network analysis survey, we did ask a couple of additional questions that I was actually taking a look at this morning to get at a little bit about sort of if there was sort of a trigger that spurred it, and then also what momentum has or has not looked like for the initiative over the past few years. And it's pretty interesting. So everyone, to Jill's point, cited, that there was this sort of political will and this decision maker, head policy maker, usually the mayor, that really got behind it. In one city, at least, they said that it was because they saw the highest pedestrian death rates they had ever seen at that time for their city. And so that got the mayor on board. And then the mayor immediately made them create a Vision Zero plan. And there were metrics and organizations were held accountable for meeting those metrics. In another city, they cited that the Department of Transportation was very much on board, but they had to do a lot of pushing, a lot of advocating, and it took quite a bit of time to finally get, again, generally the mayor on board to kind of push for this and to help create sort of the action plan and get sort of all the stakeholders involved. So it's kind of interesting to see sort of how these different cities come at it and how it actually gets adopted.
That is Becky. Oh. Yeah, thank you for that, Becky. Yeah.
Yeah, so staff awareness, it sounds like pushed things kind of in both situations, but especially in the latter one you described. This was Libby. I always think of that afterwards. Libby again. I'm wondering what you've learned about the equity question, and I think that ties into maybe part of the resistance, that there's multiple streams of values going on here that have helped push these things forward. And can you say anything at this point about?
This is Seth. I'm responding to Libby, who's here at HSRC. We haven't actually delved into that quite yet. I suspect that what we'll find is that what we tend to find is that those places more receptive tend to be the more privileged places. That it probably is beginning in those places. Almost anything you can see when it's first introduced, bike share, separated bike lanes and neighborhoods, it tends to be those more sort of well-endowed neighborhoods that are asking for that. And then eventually it comes around. So that I think a lot of our work, if we are talking about implementation, is to sort of accelerate that process so that it eventually gets to the places that actually is needed most. I think what happens is that if it's totally top-down without consideration of sort of on-the-ground public support, then you're going to get that sort of reactance and other things. And they have to be thoughtful about how it's implemented.
Have you been able to see any differences in that? This is Libby again at HSRC. I'm wondering if they're I think New York City had lots of borough-based community meetings. I don't know if the others had as much public engagement. So have you been able to see any difference in their programs or strategies or success in regards to how much public engagement they
yeah, it's another good question. They sort of lay that out in a lot of the plans. New York, like you were mentioning, they seem to have pretty robust, for even before they adopted Vision Zero, they've had a decent sort of public engagement program and strategy based upon the boroughs and things. I can't say I'm really too familiar with the other cities. A lot of them will sort of lay that out in their plans, and they all seem to have a decent means of doing outreach and things, but it's hard to tell. Yeah, it's hard to really compare across. To Becky's point, I definitely do see some different structures in terms of the sort of leadership. Like in New York, it was basically an edict from the mayor's office where they're going to do this. Whereas in the Western cities, it doesn't seem to be so much that. It's sort of a more bottom-up organizational that then finally gets the leaders on board. Seems to be a different, maybe it's an East Coast, West Coast difference. I don't know. Sort of like the rap
It's
battle.
like a rap battle.
That's right. Yeah, it might be.
Yeah, and Seth, this is Kelly. I know for Seattle, the city that I worked on, that the mayor's office was very important, and the relaunch came from a mayor's announcement, relaunching from Target Zero to Vision Zero.
Oh, is that right? Interesting.
Yeah, and with the change in mayor, they get concerned about what will happen to the Vision Zero program. So.
That's a great point. It's a great point, Kelly. Yeah, that's one of the things we wonder about is, does this transcend offices in politics? Yeah, hopefully. Steve is making a point that it might be too linear in categorizing liberal versus non-liberal. It's a classic error.
Hey, hey, Seth, yeah.
It's a classic error that us liberals fall into. Yeah.
Did we say that?
Hey, this is Steve. I'm sorry about my inability to type this morning. My limited understanding of moral philosophy is that liberal people who tend to vote liberal often tend to underestimate the complexity of the value systems of people who vote in more conservative ways. And so I think we are underestimating. I think we're feeling there's no answer when in fact there actually are answers. We're just not able to perceive them very clearly from within our value system. But I think one solution is to optimize or minimize the number of injury crashes. Or look at the ratio of injury to non-injury crashes, because I think that is a part of the complexity of the value system becomes clearer once you look at that. And I guess I feel like the people are important, but they're not all that important, because the roadways actually have stability beyond how voters vote. So once you've made roadway changes, they tend to stick around. And actually the diffusion of innovation is not among people as much as it is along a roadway. And I think we tend to underestimate the way that people change their behaviors as they move between different roadways. And actually the behavior change we want in some respects is to change the culture of a roadway segment. Rather than the driving behavior of people, because the driving behavior of people is very volatile. But to change a culture, it seems like working on the roadway is more important than working on the users of the roadway in terms of achieving long-term stable change.
Anyone else want to respond to Steve? Yeah, Steve, this is Seth. A solid point. It's something we've discussed here at HSRC for a long time. If we want to talk about sustainable change, we do need to focus on sort of the infrastructure. And you're right. I think a lot of it is, if we were to sort of step back and say, okay, let's talk about long-term change here. We do need to focus, and I guess that relates to a lot of the work we're looking at, sort of the actors and organizations involved in these sort of physical network decision making, right? How the roads look and feel. We're looking at the whole political, social process of that. It's a good point.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It is a very, very old idea in highway safety. But I guess highway safety has never thought about, like the stages of change model in terms of a roadway, or public health has never thought about a roadway as an entity that goes through stages of change. Mm-hmm. But I think in the same way that you want to put a smoker into maintenance of non-smoking, ultimately, same way you want to take a roadway into maintenance of being a low injury crash roadway.
So would you say Martin Luther King Boulevard is in the pre-contemplative stage? Is that?
Well, MLK Boulevard is a pre-contemplator.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think MLK is, so just for the West Coast and other audiences, this Seth's referring to the roadway outside his office, which has multiple pedestrian safety engineering interventions along it, including the flashing lights and the day-glow signage and everything else. No, I think it's a maintenance, but I guess it's a conflicted roadway, Seth, because it is a 4-lane highway.
Yeah.
Steve, this is Jennifer Woody, and I wanted to just draw out and see your thoughts about the process of influencing the people who make the decisions about the money to do whatever to the roadways.
I think that's entree, not product.
Yes. No, I agree. And I mean, I'm just saying, like, I think that, like, again, our ultimate goal is to do those infrastructure changes that don't require us to constantly be trying to fix people, which we can't do. But so are you saying that we want to get to a place where the decisions that are made about roadways are of a different nature, like permanently?
Well, Jennifer, yeah, I think that that sort of public health theory, we've been thinking of it as something that you apply to people. But in this situation, you know, road segments have some of the attributes that we ascribe to people.
This is Jennifer. I don't know if y'all saw the note that Tad sent out. We have 1 more minute left, so there's been some great discussion, but we might want to wrap up really quick. If anybody has a 20-second comment or question, we could probably move that in, but otherwise.
This is Steve. I wanted to thank Jill and Safric for their contributions to this project, which were really helpful. And I want to thank the whole team because I think it was a really great project and look forward to the year 2 extension of it.
Yeah, I think
We've been honored to work on it.
Okay.
Tab, were you saying something?
Yeah, I was just going to say this was great, but I didn't want to cut off whoever else was about to come up with a good point.
Okay.
But if that's all the questions, thank you, everybody. This was really a fascinating discussion. Sorry if you can hear, there's a movie going on in the background. So sorry for the background noise. But if there are no further questions, I want to thank Seth for a fantastic presentation, and to the rest of you, say we'll see you in a month, or I guess in 2 weeks.
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye, everybody.